On today's Locked On Bucks, we continue our look back at individual performances from last season. We already did Giannis. The other big name you would inevitably hear when discussing the Bucks is Damian Lillard. So we do a deep dive into Damian Lillard's first season in the Cream City. What to take away from that season, what to look forward to next season, all of the numbers. We get into it next on Locked On Bucks.
You are Locked On Bucks, your daily Milwaukee Bucks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome into Locked On Bucks. I'm Justin Garcia. You can find me on the Bucks Radio Network, joined by Camille Davis, who you can find on the Technical Foul podcast, the Pack a Day podcast, and the Carry the G and MKE podcast. Is a big day yesterday. Before we get to our Bucks content, are you a pour over the schedule and pay so much attention to the NFL schedule person, Camille?
I mean, now that the schedule release is a thing where teams are like trying to be creative and make it funny, like I'm into that piece of it. But like strength of schedule at this point in the year, I've always been like, that's not going to hold up when the season starts. The teams change too much.
So you don't go line by line and win, loss.
No.
So speaking of, well, I was going to try to say schedule releases or some type of release, but the euphoria that a lot of Wisconsinites and Packers fans felt yesterday with learning when these opponents would be coming to Green Bay and vice versa. You felt the same amount of euphoria when the release came that Damian Lillard was joining the Bucks on, what was it, September 27th, late September. We talked about this the other day with Brian at Bucks Film Room. We all had these grand visions of what that was going to bring. We all thought it was going to be a seamless fit. I think there were a few voices that were pointing out, hey, this isn't going to be as easy as you think. But needless to say, it did not go as we fully expected. There's a lot behind the whys that we can and will get into. A lot of it we've already touched on throughout various shows this season. But I'm going to put you on the spot here.
Oh, boy.
If I told you to assign a letter grade to Damian Lillard's first season in Milwaukee, what would it be?
I think I'd give him a good like B, maybe a B minus. Just
Okay,
like I think it was. Be clear, I'm saying B as in boy for those who are thinking. I said like it's a passing grade for sure. Just given the amount of change and upheaval that came into play. Like I recall that I was on Bucks Talk with you to start the season, and the question was like, I think your over and under was like 59 points combined between Giannis and Dame. Do they go over or under? And I was like, I'm going under. I think I went under at like 53 or 54 combined points between the two.
Wow,
and I just thought, I just think it's going to take them a little while to kind of figure that out. And plus, like there are two ball dominant superstars that they're going to have to figure that piece out. And over the course of the season, like we saw the ups and downs. We saw the Trailblazer fans being like, guys, he always starts slow. Like, trust me, come, January, February, he's going to be cooking and you guys are going to see. And we saw like December was really good for Dame and then January wasn't, but then there's a coaching switch and then Doc comes in and then Dame admits like, I have not been able to really find my place so far. And like his best clarity came once Doc came into the picture. So because of all like these other circumstances that were going on around and just trying to learn, like, I don't think that we got the full Damian Lillard experience yet. And that he even mentioned it himself. Like, I think people underestimate exactly what the offseason and all that stuff means, like the stability. He's like, you just wait till you see how I look next year. So I feel like a B minus probably fits where I would rank him this season.
I was going to say B minus with the caveat that I think we all understand there's a lot that went into it. He's talked at length, not being able to work out, didn't feel he was in the shape that he should have been coming into the season because of that and because of the complications of knowing you were going to be traded, but not knowing where and not being able to do some of those things that you were used to doing because you couldn't risk getting injured for the trade. Trying to figure out this pairing with Giannis. It never really seemed, I don't mean this to be a pile on Adrian Griffin episode. It never seemed to be great under Griff with those two. That's when we were having most of those discussions of why are they not running the 2-man game as much?
Mhm.
And the response that we would get was, we don't want to spam it because then people will figure out how to defend it more. But Dame just never looked comfortable. I think that was the spot where it was pretty clearly your turn, my turn type of deal with Dame and Giannis. Dame would take over when Giannis was off the floor and vice versa. We talked about that Raptors game earlier in the year where Dame was incredible. I think 36 points and really gave you, okay, this is what we expected to see.
Mhm.
Giannis didn't play in that game and vice versa. We saw Giannis do that against the Pacers with no Dame on the floor. So I think that was the challenge early. I don't think Damian Lillard was bad, right?
Me
Like
neither.
that was the discussion, especially externally. By that, I mean media-wise, externally, like national media, about, man, Damian Lillard, he's terrible. This is not what the Bucks expected to get. Was it the guy that you were hoping for? Probably not. It wasn't the guy you saw last year where he was an all-NBA player again, averaged more than 30 points a game. But his efficiency and all of that, it just wasn't where you expected it to be. The only spot where it was free throws, where he shot 92% at the free throw line. His field goal percentage was down to figures that it had not been since very early in his career. And same with 3-point shooting. I'll throw out that 29 game season he played in 2 years ago. Taking that out of the mix, his 3-point percentage was the lowest we had seen since the 2014-15 season. So almost a decade ago, which 35%, I don't know if it's just being prisoner of the moment because you remember what he did in the playoffs. You see the number 35% from three for Dame and you think, man, that was it. I feel like I saw him hit at a higher clip. But if we go back to January or February, I think the conversation was, man, when is Dame going to start hitting threes?
Yeah, that's the thing with this season with Dame, where again, we heard the Blazers fans saying like it takes a little while that he gets rolling, but this season it felt like it kind of like you would see him have a good month or a good stretch for a little while, and then it would be a stretch where it's like the ball just cannot find the net for some reason. Like December was the month with Dame where I was like, okay, I see exactly what this is. Like it's starting to come into place. In the month of December, Dame was shooting 43% from three, averaging a little bit over 26 points per game. Like it was looking really good. And then came January, a month that you just mentioned, where then Dame was shooting 28% from three. And it just kind of kept bouncing that way. February, 36%, March, 41%. And then April, 28%. Of course, smaller sample size in the month of April there, not including the playoffs. So that just piece of consistency and just trying to find it with Dame was a big piece as well. And then you mentioned just looking at the numbers and how they compare to years past. Now, last season was like a career year for Dame, where it was like, wow, he still has this much in the tank at this point in the season, like in his career, I mean, and it was really fun to watch. So I think a lot of what people were thinking with him coming on to this season was like, that 32 he averaged and Giannis is 30, like boom, we're gonna have a duo scoring 60 points a game night in and night out. But it just did not work that way, particularly for Dame. And an interesting thing with Dame for me, and looking at this season and kind of comparing it to some of his seasons of the past, was just the minutes per game. Like we talked about Giannis, and his sweet spot of minutes per game is probably around like 32-ish, somewhere in there. And like that's this past season that we just had was the most minutes that Giannis has played in some time. You look at Dame averaged about 35 minutes per game this year. And that's pretty on par with what Dame tends to average. He averaged 36 the last 2 years before this, almost 36, 2021. He averaged almost 38 minutes a game in that 2019-20 season. So like Dame is somebody, even his career minutes per game is around 36. So for him to come in and play 35, it's another question, like we talked about with trying to get guys on this team to the playoffs. Do we see more rest inserted? Do we see some things change with that, just given the age with the team? But Dame's minutes really shocked me of seeing like he's consistently been playing some high minutes in the regular season throughout his entire career.
Yeah, and I think when we look at his numbers, there were a couple of things that stand out in terms of shot profile, how he got to those numbers. And it does lead to some questions for next year and the next couple of years, which I do want to get to coming up after the break. So we'll take a look at Damian Lillard's shot profile this past year with the Bucks. What were the differences between this and what we'd seen really for most of his stay in Portland? And does that tell us anything going forward, or was this just an anomaly year? We'll get into that conversation coming up after the break here on Locked On Bucks. Time to talk to you about our friends over at eBay Motors, because passion, drive, and patience is the formula for winning championships, and it is also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. Superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay's guaranteed fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home huge wins. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay guaranteed fit only available to U.S. customers. And if you're watching Fox Sports or ESPN all day and have to turn down the TV because of all the screaming, make the switch to Locked On Sports today. It is a free 24/7 sports streaming channel, and it is programmed for you. Every single day, it brings you the biggest stories without all of that screaming. It's because Locked On Sports today brings you can't-miss analysis, opinions, and news. It streams 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. When looking at Dame's shot profile, so let's also knock this out of the way. He turns 34 on July 15th.
Yep.
So again, it's as we had the conversation with Brian the other day. Hey, get younger. Well, it's not that easy when these are your guys and this is what you're positioned to do. But Dame is one of those guys that is in the, well, he's approaching his mid 30s category. And when that starts to happen, I remember 2 years ago, we were hearing the same conversations with James Harden. He's not getting to the rim as much. And is he the same guy? That is inevitably going to come your way once you start to approach that age. And if your shooting numbers dip a little bit, as we saw for Dame. So his effective field goal percentage was the lowest we had seen since the 15-16 season. And what stood out most to me was where Dame was taking his shots from. So again, there's more that goes into it other than just, well, he's old and he can't do this anymore. But I think what was notable was he took fewer shots at the rim. His percentage, his shot diet, about a third of his shots were coming at the rim in Portland. And about 50% of them were coming at three-point lines. Last year, it was just over 25% that Dame's shots at the rim, shots he took at the rim. His volume of mid-range shots went up, and his volume of shots at the rim and shots from three went down. So I think on the one hand, you can view that and say, well, he's an older player and the burst isn't there anymore, so he can't get to those spots. He can't get to the rim. I am surprised the three-point numbers weren't a little higher. That would seemingly be the easiest. If you're fatigued, you pull up, you take a three, especially with Dame's ability. But the mid-range, we did see quite a bit of mid-range shots from Dame this past season. Look, if it's something that gets you going and gets you comfortable, I think we had that conversation about Chris 5 years ago. And we haven't had it since. He's added some more threes to his diet as well. So I don't really know what to make of that, because I don't want to sound like I'm blindly optimistic here, but I understand you could look at he's taking fewer shots at the rim as a bad thing and say, well, this is where you really start to see the numbers go down when that drops, because you're not getting the easier looks and because it typically means you don't have the burst or athleticism to get there anymore. But that's not what we saw late in the season and in the postseason. So I think the bigger piece of it is what you mentioned before too, probably figuring out how do we get you maximized to where you feel like you have your shot, but we can do it at a comfortable amount of games and minutes.
Yeah, it's just, I think part of it is just finding his spot on the floor with the new team was part of it as well. To your point about how we saw in the playoffs, like when Dame went down in that Pacers series, the one thing I was thinking about was like, wow, who is going to put pressure on the rim now that Dame is out when we did not have Giannis? Because Dame was somebody who would try to put pressure on the rim. And even if he wasn't able to convert the field goal, a lot of times he was getting fouled. So he was heading to the free throw line and he's still able to figure out a way to keep the points moving for the Milwaukee Bucks in that way. But I mean, as you mentioned, as you get older, the athleticism tends to just dwindle. And that's just human condition. It's not specific to Dame, specific to James Harden, as you used as an example. And with James Harden, I remember the conversation that maybe James should take more mid-range shots. Like he has it in his bag. He just doesn't go for it because he was so focused on that three and getting to the rim. And of course, there are a lot of people going to say, well, that's analytics' fault, so on and so forth. But the thing with analytics is not saying that all mid-range shots are bad. It's about who's taking those shots, right? So seeing that Damian LIllard actually had a year where he was taking more shots from mid-range is really interesting to me because if you just think about what you saw, like you said, I would have thought that heavy diet at the three, some drives there, and the mid-range kind of felt like something like I'm just trying to get going a little bit or catching somebody off guard. So I think with Dame and how he continues to age, just given the fact that he is so talented at scoring, you might see him lean on the mid-range more, which I'm a mid-range. I love the mid-range game. So I'm always here for that. But it's another way to get yourself going as well. And think about the way that he is being defended. We saw him be defended, I should say, as a member of the Milwaukee Bucks, where he's getting picked up full court pressure. He is trying to have guys set high screens for him so he can get some room to move and get into a clear space where he can operate. So if the mid-range is something else that's going to be a part of his shot diet a little bit heavier going forward, you could see ways where that becomes beneficial for the Bucks as well, just given the coverage that he has on him, as well as what you see with Giannis as well. So it also makes it interesting to think about some of those times where they do some inverted screening where Dame might be screening for Giannis and what you can get out of that as well if he has that comfort there. So the mid-range piece is interesting to me. Necessarily surprised me a little bit to hear it that way. But I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing going forward for Dame as well. A three-level score is a three-level score.
Yeah, it's not a bad thing. I think what you would point to, and again, I don't know how much of this to single out versus everything else that we've touched on with Dame's season. He wasn't good in the mid-range this past season. So again, that's the challenge is you're going to hear a lot of it didn't work and this isn't the pairing we envisioned and Dame isn't Dame anymore and he's getting older. And look, those are logical places to jump to, but I just have a challenge of fully accepting that, knowing everything we've talked about through the season and that, look, he didn't get a chance to do X, Y, and Z in the summer. He himself said, wasn't in the best shape I needed to be in because of that. And I think that carried through the season, which would point to, hey, it doesn't look like he has it this night, or doesn't look like he has that same amount of burst, because we saw it in spots and we saw it, when? After the All-Star break, in the postseason, after a week-long layoff, when he had more chances to do those things is when you saw it. So he's probably the most challenging singular player to really dissect here on the roster because of everything that happened for him, both on and off the court. And I think you cannot overstate too what we've talked about throughout the year is you mentioned he had a career year last year in Portland with the Blazers. He was Giannis, right? He was Giannis for a decade in Portland, averaged 32 points a game last year. He comes to Milwaukee where he knows he's not Giannis. I mean, he's still Dame. It's not like you're acquiring Malik Beasley, but he's not going to get that same amount of volume. His usage dipped slightly, right? He was used to a 30% usage rate. The points created on his shot attempts, those dipped as well. And again, part of that was figuring out the your spot, my spot type of thing and getting that chemistry. And the other one was his assist rate dropped, of percentage of team-made field goals that Dame assisted on. It was about a third of those in Portland. It was not here in Milwaukee, but you would point to, well, you got this guy named Giannis. You've got Chris Middleton that can assist on those field goals as well. So a lot of variables that go into it. And I think that's just the big takeaway here is Did it go as planned? No. Is this a total, this was a disaster, you got to move on from this? Absolutely not. I think there are some signs that, at least numbers, I should say, that at least have you raise an eyebrow and say, okay, let's monitor this next season. But for every one of those, I think there's other things that we touched on of, well, he himself has said a full off season of knowing I'm a Milwaukee Buck. These are my teammates, at least these guys that I know of. These are the things we can work on. I know Doc Rivers. I got to know him as a head coach. I know what he's going to expect from me. It was just so much uncertainty. And then, oh, by the way, coming a week before training camp starts, that trade happened.
Yeah, and I mean, we also haven't mentioned on this particular episode, but Terry Stotts and that departure as well, really early on before the season even kicks off, and how that might have affected the offensive flow for this Bucks team as well. Like, there was a certain level of comfort that came from having some familiarity somewhere in a new situation. And then Stotts was gone before the season even really got underway. So that was another learning curve there for him. But to your point about just being it's inconsistent year for Dame for sure. And he even admitted it, like we've mentioned, that he can be better in certain areas of his game. Like, there is no way Dame looked at this season and was like, this is it. Like, this is the best I got. Like, he himself was like, I know I can get better here, and having the stability and location, coach, key teammates. Like, I get it. And that's going to help me so much more next year. And I mean, it's not as if we didn't see any positives from Dame in Milwaukee this year. I mean, we saw the game one in the playoffs. We saw pairings. I mean, even under Doc Rivers, we saw Dame and Giannis become the first teammates to score 25 points and hand out 12 assists in the same game against the Lakers. Like, they were starting to doing things what comes between duos. We're like, oh, we haven't seen this before. Like, they were the second duo since 1980 to score at least 30 points while having 10 assists. So, like, there are certain things with their game as they continue to grow under Doc that I think is going to get better between the two, and that comfort level is going to go up as well, because to be a new player on a new team and trying to find your place is hard. To do that while being a point guard, when it's your job to kind of get everybody in order and everybody in alignment, but you're also sitting here trying to figure out, I'm trying to get them together, but I'm also trying to figure out where my spots are. That's a little difficult coming from a point guard. So although it wasn't, as seamless of a fit in year one as we thought it was, I think that next year, I have some high hopes for next year.
I have elevated hopes for next year. Again, I think the elephant in the room is going to be, there are a lot of things, and that's with the assumption you keep the big three intact, which I know we are fully endorsing. Brian Sampson, when we had him on, same thing that he said, you keep the big three intact. How do you tinker around them? I'm not saying that means you have to trade Brook Lopez or Bobby Portis, but again, those are the names that are going to come up the most because of their contracts. And because of the Bobby Portis factor as well, is he's due for an extension. So it's either bleep or get off the pot in most cases. Do you extend him? If not, you're not going to go into a walk year with him. But those three you feel good about. How do you get them help around the perimeter? The defense, I get it, was not great. And especially before Doc arrived, we saw some signs of improvement after that. But that is going to be the big thing, is pairings with Dame, because Malik Beasley was probably a suboptimal pairing to have with him. He can light it up. We were all stunned that Malik was starting. We thought he'd be your bench scorer, and he was asked to do something that he had never done before, and that is take on this significant role as a stopper. You're going to run into problems when that's your backcourt. So I think, again, that trade made more sense, or the signing made a lot more sense. It made sense in general. It was a veteran's minimum, but you could see how it would work when Drew Holiday was next to him. When Dame arrived, that changed things. So that's going to be the big piece, is finding who to play in the backcourt with Damian Lillard to mask some of those shortcomings, his size and his ability defensively. Knowing, look, we should have more than enough offense. If we get Dame going, if we have Chris, especially Chris that we saw in the playoffs, and Giannis, that's our scoring. The pieces around it, we need them to be able to defend and ideally be versatile defenders. And I think those things are going to help Damian Lillard as well coming up this upcoming season here. So we'll wrap up our look at Dame. Some other numbers that stood out that I don't know if there's anything to take away from those, and just a view at next season for Damian Lillard, the particulars behind the contract and everything else. We'll get into that conversation after this on Locked On Bucks. Well, time to talk to you about BetterHelp, as this next segment is sponsored by BetterHelp. And this is a stressful time for many of us. We just passed Mother's Day weekend. That can be an added stressor for moms, for children, anybody that is dealing with any type of family stress and anything else that you would need to get ready for that day. Maybe it's just not a great scene in general. It can bring on all kinds of stress. That's where BetterHelp is here to assist you. We oftentimes have all these different stressors in our lives, big or small. Most of us keep them bottled up. That starts to affect you negatively. Therapy, though, is a safe space. It's where you can get things off your chest. You can figure out how to work through whatever it is that is weighing you down. And again, that's where BetterHelp comes in to help you. If you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. They're entirely online, designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. All you have to do is fill out a brief questionnaire, and from there, you'll get matched with a licensed therapist. You can even switch therapists at any time for no additional charge. So get it off your chest with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com/LockedOnNBA today and get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/LockedOnNBA. Well, I mentioned some numbers. I'm not quite sure what to make of, Camille, but Damian Lillard, I think we pointed out a lot of these numbers throughout the year, but when Dame was on the floor, go figure, the Bucks were a much better team, both offensively and defensively. Now, the caveat attached to that is when Dame's on the floor, it's not necessarily saying that Giannis and others are not on the floor as well. So that undoubtedly lifts that defensive number. But they had about a 114 defensive rating through cleaning the glass, taking out garbage time with Dame on the floor. 116 overall. But the interesting part to me was, I mentioned the offense went up with Dame on the floor. It went down with Dame on the floor. Down isn't a good thing. The number dropped. With Dame on the floor and Giannis off the floor, same thing. Defense on the defensive side went down to a 114.5 rating. The offense also went down to a 114 rating from about a 118 overall. So there's a lot of these quirks and interesting things that you just look at and file away and say, not sure what to make of that. Either that you would assume, okay, the defense is going to go up a little bit. The offense will also go up. That was not the case. I chalk up that defensive number getting better with Dame on the floor, even with Giannis off, to just Brook Lopez being back there as a rim protector. But that to me is the big thing to really circle in on, is there was never really the comfort that it was kind of like Dame was the substitute teacher, even in those games where Giannis was out, and you would see Dame take over offensively. He would have a couple of those bursts, but the minutes that Giannis was off the floor, it still felt like a feeling out process. And to me, if there's one singular thing to look at in terms of, all right, improvement here, we got to see it next year, it's that. And it's maybe not so much any of the individual numbers for Dame outside of efficiency, but it's that. When Giannis is off the floor and Dame is on the floor, offense has to get better. And that wasn't the case last season.
Yeah, because that's what you think of when you think of Damian Lillard. You think of the offense. Like, he's never been known as a defensive guard, which, I mean, going from Drew Holiday to Damian Lillard, that was the big conversation around it. Like, you're losing so much defense, you're losing this, but it's like, what are you gaining? So to your point about the numbers on and off with Dame, that like the offensive number for sure is one that you would hope to go up. But one thing about that with the numbers with Dame on and off, and I'm seeing it in the comments here as we record live on YouTube a bit about Damian Lillard's defense and how viable it is. Like, how likely is it to have a good defense if, you know, your point guard is a 6'1" guy who's not known for playing defense? He's an offensive first guard. So what do you do with that? And I think that goes to what we were just talking about in the last segment, which is like what you have around them. Like, you mentioned the backcourt pairing of Damian Lillard and Malik Beasley. Like, okay, it makes sense if you're trying to get some quick buckets, but putting Malik Beasley on the toughest offensive, guy on the other team, defensively left some holes in the game there. And with those numbers, like, of course, we've talked about Brook Lopez and what that all means, but defense is such a connected thing. Like, that's why the best defenses, it feels like everybody is on a string where somebody moves, you have to rotate. Everybody behind them is doing the same thing as well. And that's one thing with this Bucks team that we saw early on in the year in particular, where the rotations they were not sharp at all, where you're just like, you're seeing guys throwing their hands up, shrugging at each other, like, well, where were you at? So on and so forth. So I think one thing about with Dame's piece in all of this is just like, okay, how do we put the strongest five on the court that can do everything we need? So like you mentioned, Dame, Giannis, and Chris, you're expecting a lot of the offense to come through them. We know what Giannis can do defensively as well, especially as a help defender. So it's like, okay, for your starting 2 spot and your starting center spot, what do you need around to make that threesome between, Dame, Chris, and Giannis work better? And Dame's place in that, like, he just has to show the effort, especially in moments that matter. And we saw that with Dame at points throughout the season where we saw him get mad. Was it the Boston game where he got pulled at the end for defense? And he was like, I do not want to be pulled. Like, I'm going to show you, like, I can be on the court in crunch time defensively as well. We saw Dame, he has active hands. Like, we saw Dame when he's really trying to he can be in the right spot. I'm not saying that Damian LIllard is like a really great defender, but you don't necessarily need everyone to be great. You need everybody to understand their role in the team defense and then how to try to overcome the shortcomings the other team might attack you on. So there's a piece of chess in there as well, and finding the right formula to make that look better. And I think that depending on who you have around that big three, like, that defensive number can be solid.
Yeah, and again, it's all about the other pieces around them. That's how you're going to mask some of those deficiencies, and especially the size with Dame. Ideally, look, we see in the comments, and I mean, we'd all love to get there too, where, hey, could you find a very switchable big that you play next to Giannis? Could you find a guy that's a great perimeter defender that you play next to Dame? And then you can essentially switch everything and try to hide Dame a little bit more. And you can take, if they have a non-offensive big, throw Dame on them. So that way, when they do initiate the switches, that's what you're looking at. The challenge is, look, every team wants to do that, number one, and you probably are dealing with veterans minimums only, unless you make some type of trade that to send out money and bring in picks or something. That's what you're looking at. So I think you can get there, and I think it's clearly going to be a point of emphasis from this team. We heard Doc Rivers initiate that from day one or from minute one in his end of season press conference of, you can't win with a bad defense in this league. And, look, is he a better defensive player than Damian Lillard? I think most would say yes, he is. But look at Cleveland and what they've done with their defense. That was one of the best throughout the regular season. Taking a look at the postseason numbers for the Cavaliers, they were right in the middle of the pack defensively. It's a backcourt that's Darius Garland and Donovan Mitchell, which, Donovan Mitchell, I don't think anybody would say is a great defender. There are ways to get there. They also have one very switchable mobile big, one great rim protecting big, very good rim protecting big, and somebody that's out there in a Okoro that is out there for defense and switchability. So it's all about what you sprinkle around that group. That three isn't going anywhere. And look, you can point to Chris Middleton being on one leg. Well, that one leg was pretty freaking good in the playoffs. And if that's the version of Chris that you can nurse and get for the postseason, even if it means, and I think this is our PSA here, which we probably, we'll save it for the Chris Middleton show. But that version of Chris was good enough. You didn't see Giannis, right? So that changes how you view everything. But it's hard not to watch these playoffs and think, man, Giannis would have been pretty good here. But same with Dame, right? So those three guys aren't going anywhere. I think you know what to expect from them. It's how you fill in the margins around them. And again, I said this at the time of the trade last year, you're not going to be an elite defense anymore. It's not just Dame, it's Malik Beasley. It's the absence of a guy like Wesley Matthews. There's a lot of changes that you went through. You're not going to be this elite defense anymore. So what do you shoot for? And my thought was, look, if you can get to around 12 defensively, fantastic. That should be more than good enough with this offense. We saw stretches of that under Doc Rivers. And I think that's the number that you have to kind of draw in the sand and say, maybe we're not elite unless the Bucks have another home run in them where they bring in something that really massively upgrades the defense. But can we get to 12, 13, something like that, and keep our defense there? Because if we do, that should be more than good enough with these three guys offensively and with year number 1.5 or 2 in the system under Doc Rivers, and just familiarity with each other. And for Damian Lillard, that's going to be the biggest piece of it all. Is I know Milwaukee, I know Doc Rivers, I know where Giannis likes to get the ball, I know how Giannis plays. So now let's really attack this season.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know as we close here, we're going to take a look at the contract situation with Damian Lillard as well. And I mean, listen, there are people who look at what John Horst has done and they're not impressed. When I I personally can't say I'm in that camp. I did not think that the Bucks would be able to get Damian Lillard to begin with this particular season. And now that we have him here in Milwaukee, it's not like he's going to be here forever. Like, we understand this is a certain window of time at the moment that the Bucks are trying to see if this fit works. Giannis and Dame, the pairing makes a lot of sense on paper. And as we saw during the regular season as well, like, you can see the potential of it. It just needed some time for them to really put that synergy together, which I think this offseason we will see a little bit more. But the reality of it is this upcoming season, I don't want to say it's the last go. You might feel like it's the last chance with this group. And I mean, it could be if things don't go well, but it's not as if we have a lot of time to try to figure this all out. So like this upcoming season for the Milwaukee Bucks with Damian Lillard and Giannis and Chris and so on and so forth is going to be I don't want to say a last shot, almost though, for this team to really figure out if this is a grouping that can work and get them to that championship, because we understand the level of urgency that this team has been working with of trying to get back to that championship game. Shoot, at this point, trying to get out the first round of the playoffs, since we haven't done that the last 2 years.
Yeah, so the Bucks have no likely exceptions to use. They are $45.9 million over the cap here. They avoided the second apron for this season. They will not avoid it for next season unless it just becomes a total teardown, which we do not foresee happening for Damian Lillard. We mentioned he and Giannis basically attached at the hip as they both have the same contract figure next year at $48.7 million. They have the same contract figure in 25-26 at $54.2 million, and they would have the same in 26-27 if Damian Lillard picks up his player option at $58.6 million. The year after, the 27-28, is when Giannis has his player option. So to that point, it's probably 2 years that you look at in this upcoming season and the 25-26 season, where Giannis and Dame are under contract. Chris Middleton has a player option. And it's important to point out Chris Middleton's a year younger than Dame. So as much hate as he gets in these comments here, maybe Chris Middleton will do maybe not the same length or volume, but something similar to Drew Holiday and others, and what he did this past summer. You decline the player option, you take a more team-friendly deal to give some cap shavings, but that's basically it. I think you can comfortably say 2 years. Who knows how this looks and where it goes after the second year, but next year is probably it with this full group in place.
Yeah. So like, there's some time to figure it out, but there's also not a lot of time to figure it out for this team. And especially when you look at what's going on around them in the league as well. Who else is coming up in the East? Other teams that are also making moves, and we haven't even gotten to free agency yet. So to bring everything back around, it is of the utmost importance for the Milwaukee Bucks to figure out a way to have real synergy between Giannis and Dame, and also Chris as well, to try to make that fit feel a lot more together and connected, rather than having it be my turn, your turn. And I think that this is going to be a big offseason for the Bucks, with time to figure things out, have plans, understand how Doc wants to use them, and get back to it, because I don't think it was a bad Damian Lillard season for his first year here in Milwaukee, but It wasn't what people thought, which might have been unrealistic expectations at some points, more of a 2K mind frame of we're putting these guys together. It's going to work immediately. But also, I don't think it was a terrible year for him. So like there's room for improvement for sure. And things that leave me hopeful for next season and what this team can look like being, led by Dame and Chris and Giannis.
So that's it for the Damian Lillard show. Leave your comments on YouTube. The grade that you would assign Dame's first year here in Milwaukee, or any other takeaways you have, and we'll address those in the comment section and on our next show. And speaking of our next show, looking at the comments here, I think you will all be thrilled to know the next show is when we're going to take a look at Chris Middleton's season. So all of the vitriol that is out there, be sure to bring that on tomorrow's show as well, when we address Chris Middleton's season that just wrapped up and his incredible postseason run. So we'll get to that on tomorrow's show. For Camille, I'm Justin. We'll talk to you once again tomorrow on Locked On Bucks.